So today we're going to start talking about Western Europe in the post-classical period, starting with the early Middle Ages, and then in class we'll talk about the rest of the Middle Ages together. So, talking about what happened just after the fall of Rome. So, again, we can divide the Middle Ages in Europe, which, again, the Middle Ages just refers to this period in Western Europe between Rome and when they reemerge. It's kind of like a dark period, right? The Dark Ages. But we can divide it into three different phases. So today we're just going to be talking about the early Middle Ages from 500 to 900. Starting in 900, we start to have some changes in Europe where things start to brighten up a little bit, and that is the High Middle Ages, which we'll talk about in class. So let's get started. So after the fall of Rome, of course, the western side of the empire completely divides. And they enter, of course, what we usually refer to as the Dark Ages, because quite literally, the light went out, right? Intellectual life basically disappeared. Agriculture declined. They actually forgot things, right, that they had known before. Civilization did continue to spread northward over time. However, it was very unstable, partially because of the Vikings, who were Scandinavians, of course, that were kind of raiding everybody and causing regional havoc. Spain, of course, was conquered by the Muslims, so Spain was actually quite separate than the rest of Western Europe, and we'll talk about that more in class. But basically, in this early phase, there really was the Catholic Church in Rome really was like the only institution that provided unity and stability in Western Europe. And so we can kind of characterize the early Middle Ages by two things: manners and the church, right? And that basically was the only system of organization that existed. So what's a manor, right? I think usually when you think of the Middle Ages, you probably think of feudalism, but manorialism is actually kind of even worse than feudalism because it's really decentralized. Because essentially, manorialism was a manor, was essentially like a self-sufficient area owned by a landlord, right, who had workers who were called serfs who lived on that manor and did all the work, and in return gave a portion of their crops to the landlord. Now, why would the peasants do this? It's because of the lack of safety that happened after Rome collapsed, right? As the empire collapsed, of course, there were people raiding each other all over. There was absolute chaos. So serfs turned to these rich landlords for protection. And of course, for that protection, these landlords would hire their own military force, the knights, right? So this sounds a lot like feudalism, but it's actually even more decentralized, because essentially each little manor was its own world, right? Like the serfs, they hardly ever left the manor. There was no king, right? There wasn't anything. It was essentially each of these little manors were completely self-sufficient, right? They had their own completely self-sufficient economic system and political system all within that manor. So it's like extremely decentralized, probably even more so than, probably even more so than feudalism. So here I have a little picture of the manor. Again, serfs pretty much never left this manor in their entire lives. It was completely self-sufficient, although albeit not very advanced, right? The peasants, of course, had their own houses out in the fields surrounding it. Often there was like a wall surrounding the manor. They would farm their own lands, and then, of course, had to give the crops to the landlord so that he could provide for his soldiers who were protecting everybody. The man of the lord, of course, had a castle. They had everything they needed there. They'd have a church. They had mills and so forth to produce grain, right? And essentially, these were just these little self-sufficient areas. Of course, life for serfs was not so good. It was very restrictive. Again, agriculture actually declined in a way because they were still using tools that were used in like Rome and Greece, which were not so suitable for the soil of Northern Europe, in France and Germany. So they actually were producing less food than they had in the Roman Empire. And again, they had to give tons of their crops to the landlord, so it was very difficult for them to get ahead. So they were essentially bound to this land. And in addition to their own land, they also had to do things for the Lord, so work on the Lord's lands and work in the Lord's castle. But again, we call them serfs and not slaves because they were still people. They weren't property, right? They couldn't be bought or sold. And they could own property themselves, like they could pass their belongings on to each other. And for the most part, as long as they did what they were supposed to, they were left alone. So, pretty difficult life, but it's not quite slavery. So, of course, the church is really the only example of solid organization we have. And as we talked about before, when the Roman Empire collapsed, that hierarchy, that organization of the Roman Empire was basically transferred to the Catholic Church. So, of course, there was a pope in Rome who was the leader of this church, and it was very hierarchical, much like the Roman Empire was, right? The pope was infallible, he could do no wrong, and was all-powerful. He was in charge of all the doctrine, he would appoint all the people below him, the bishops, and he could send directives and orders. And in fact, the pope was kind of a lord himself because he had his own territory as well, called the Papal States, that he directly ruled over. And then below him were the bishops, who ruled regional churches throughout Western Europe, and then, of course, at the manorial level, we had local priests. So this really was the only kind of like centralized organization that existed in Western Europe at this time. So as far as Christianity spreading, right, because last we left off, it was just starting to spread throughout the Roman Empire, but the barbarians, the Germans, of course, were not yet Christian. Well, that started pretty quickly after the fall of the Roman Empire. Famously, Clovis, who was one of the first chiefs of a German tribe to convert, he converted in 496 because he felt that being a Catholic would bring him like alliances in the area and therefore would help him like defeat people. Okay, so in addition to the Pope, right, there were also monasteries established throughout Western Europe. Famously, Benedict of Nursia created the Benedictine monasteries, which were some of like the most popular monasteries. And just like in Buddhism, it's monks in monasteries that really were responsible for like spreading Christianity. And however, in the Middle Ages, really monasteries were so much more important than just being a people that spread Christianity. Besides that, they also were really like the only center of learning that existed in these early Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages. Basically, monks were the only people that knew how to read. Like, they were the only literate people that were left. They were responsible for basically holding all the books that really existed in Western Europe. And basically, these monks would sit and copy manuscripts like all day long. That was the only way that people could get books because, of course, Europe didn't have a printing press yet. So these monks would just sit all day, hand copy old Roman manuscripts, and that's the only really Roman books that were continued to be used. And of course, sometimes like they didn't even really understand what they were copying because that's how much literacy had really declined. So as I had mentioned, Spain, of course, was conquered by the Arabs in 711. If you remember, there was like when the Abbasids had massacred all the Umayyads, there was one Umayyad grandson who escaped to Spain and created his own caliphate in Spain. So that was actually still part of the Umayyad caliphate, even after the rest of the Umayyad caliphate was gone. And Cordoba was the capital, so sometimes it's called the Caliphate of Cordoba. Other times it's called Al-Andalus. So all of that refers to Muslim Spain. They were expanding into Western Europe. However, in 732, the Franks, Charles Martel, who was the king of the Franks, stopped the Muslim expansion into Western Europe at the Battle of Tours. And that basically stopped them from spreading into France and then further into Europe, and kept them in Spain. So in class, we're actually going to look a little bit more at Al-Andalus and compare it with, life in the rest of Europe in this time. So with there's one exception to all of this, decentralization and manorialism, and that is Charlemagne. So there was this brief period in the early Middle Ages where they attempted to kind of recreate an empire, a Roman empire, and that was with the Franks. So there was a family called the Carolingians that were based in France. Charles Martel, who stopped the Arab expansion, was one of them. And in 800, Charles the Great, or otherwise known as Charlemagne, actually built up an empire in France and Germany and northern Italy. So you can see that he actually created quite a substantial empire in the year 800. So during Charlemagne's lifetime, when he united this big chunk of Europe, slowly they started to bring back education, although again it really was only focused on religion and the church. However, in 814 Charlemagne died, and he split his empire between three of his sons. So they split it into three different empires, and those kings were not so good. So essentially this empire only lasted for the 14 years that Charlemagne was alive. And then it fell apart. Besides that, there were some other attempts of emperors to create empires again. Most notably is the Holy Roman Empire. If you look at a map of medieval Europe, it would appear that this is quite a substantial empire. It was covered Germany and northern Italy, but really it wasn't. It wasn't an empire at all. It wasn't very Roman, it wasn't very Roman, and it was not an empire. It was just kind of a farce, right? There was this guy who called himself the Holy Roman Empire, but really he didn't have much power. It was all local lords, right? Essentially, this Holy Roman Empire was just 300 independent lordships in Germany, and in Italy, of course, city-states emerged, which were pretty much independent as well. So essentially in Western Europe, the Catholic Church provided really strong cultural unity. So they were all the same religion, and that's really the only thing that really united Western Europe at the time, but politically they were completely divided. So why? Why weren't they able to recreate an empire after the fall of Rome? Well, one was the fact that regional languages were getting stronger after the fall of Rome, right? In Rome, everybody did speak Latin, and Latin did continue to be used as the language of the church, but people stopped speaking Latin, right? The language completely died out in everyday speech, and so that was a dividing factor for Europe. Secondly, there's no bureaucracy. You cannot have an empire without a bureaucracy, right? And lords are not bureaucrats, right? They're not the same thing. Lords were super independent, and so that really blocked. And then just the fact that we had so many competing leaders constantly, and competition really defines Europe from here on out. So that's it for the early Middle Ages. Sorry for a little bit of the choppiness. I had some technical issues. But in class, we're going to get into the High Middle Ages, and that's really what we'll be focusing on. So now you've got the foundation, and see you later.